Well, I think it's important that we take a look at what was the response to the problems that were arising in the life of the church. And I simply want to share at least what my part of that response was. And as I had indicated, one of the problems in 1976 at the Minneapolis Convention was the canonical approval of the ordination of women to the priesthood and the episcopate, in spite of the fact that the Constitution didn't permit it. In fact, that Constitution was not really amended until 12 years later. And in response to the action of General Convention, there was a meeting called in Chicago by Stanley Atkins, who was at that time the Bishop of Eau Claire. As it turns out, I was his successor, although I didn't know that at the time. And the meeting was called to meet at Church of the Ascension in Chicago in December of 1976. And Chilton Powell was the Bishop of Oklahoma at the time, and he was invited to attend that meeting because he had some serious concerns about this. And he couldn't go, and he asked me if I would go in his stead. So I did go, representing Bishop Powell, to that meeting at Church of the Ascension. And it was at that meeting that the Evangelical and Catholic Mission came into existence, which was an organization for apostolic ministry and the preservation of the Catholic understanding of that ministry. And that came out of that meeting, and from that time until now, I've been deeply involved in that movement, as it were, the Evangelical and Catholic Mission, and continued under that name until 1989, when it was changed to the Episcopal Synod of America. And then in 1999, 10 years later, the name was changed to Forward in Faith North America, because similar organizations existed in the United Kingdom and in Australia, so that we had a common name internationally. And we were concerned at that point with dealing with what we saw as a major deviation from the Catholic faith of the undivided church. I had mentioned also that 3 years after that convention, in the Denver Convention, we were engaged in a very strong fight on the floor of the House of Deputies to restore the language of the House of Bishops to that resolution that said that those engaged in sexual relations outside of marriage, whether heterosexual or homosexual, were not proper candidates for ordination. And after a 4-hour floor fight, we were able to win that battle. And at that point, at least, we felt that probably the church could be turned around, even though this movement had been going on to subvert the Christian faith for some time. The next major thing that came up, and that's been alluded to, is the fact that in 1989, Jack Spong ordained Robert Williams to the diaconate, even though Robert Williams was an active practicing homosexual. And there was a great stir over this, and as a result of that, there was a meeting called in New York, and I was one of the persons invited to go to that meeting. And at that meeting, we were discussing how we might deal with this division in the life of the church. And in the course of a day of dialogue at 815 2nd Avenue, I was asked, along with 2 other bishops, to help draft a statement that would go to the presiding bishop, Ed Browning, to see if something could be said about how the church would respond to this action of Jack Spong's. And we did come up with a document, a statement, which we gave to the presiding bishop, Ed Browning. Ed Browning then took that statement and shared it with the presidents of the 9 provinces, the Council of Advice to the presiding bishop. And the presiding bishop and those 9 provincial presidents issued a statement to the church disassociating themselves from what Jack Spong had done in that ordination and citing the 1979 resolution of General Convention that it was not appropriate to ordain people who were living in a sexual relationship outside of marriage, and stating that that was the official teaching of the Episcopal Church. But that statement was coming from the presiding bishop and from the 9 provincial presidents. It was not coming from the Episcopal bishops themselves. And I then prepared a resolution to be filed with the House of Bishops, asking the House of Bishops to concur in that statement. And the House of Bishops was meeting that September in Washington, D.C., and that resolution came up for consideration. And in effect, what it did was to put the House of Bishops on record as supporting the statement of the presiding bishop and the provincial presiding bishops, disassociating ourselves from the action of Jack Spong as being contrary to the teaching of the church. That resolution was debated at the evening session, and it was a very, very hot debate. And we then called for a roll call vote. And the roll call vote was taken, and the vote was 80 for the resolution, 76 against. It passed by 4 votes, which was a very thin majority, and already told us that this was going to be an area of real concern. That in 1977, the House of Bishops had adopted resolutions at their Port St. Lucie meeting, very clearly and forcefully saying that the blessing of same-sex unions or the ordaining of practicing homosexuals is something the church could not permit. It was contrary to the church's understanding of what Holy Scripture called us to. And that was an overwhelming vote in 1977. And again in 1979, the House of Bishops, by a substantial majority, had adopted this resolution, which we had to fight for in the House of Deputies. From 1979 to 1990, which is a period of 11 years, it had gone from a substantial majority to a razor-thin 4-vote majority. And that was very, very disconcerting. I might add that at that time, Jack Spong was the Bishop of Newark, but the Assistant Bishop of Newark was Walter Ryder, who had been Bishop of Iowa. And Walter Ryder was heard to exclaim on the floor of the House of Bishops after the resolution passed, even though by only 4 votes, "I don't give a damn what the House of Bishops has said. I'm going to ordain that man to the presbyterate." And he did later on. Walter Ryder ordained Robert Williams to the priesthood. Let me just interject a little personal note at this point. It was that summer, after the resolution had been passed by the House of Bishops, but before Robert Williams was ordained to the priesthood. And I was working that summer at our diocesan conference center with our deacons school. We had a number of deacons in training, and we always do a week at the diocesan conference center in the summer, and I was teaching one of the courses there. And I get a phone call from Chicago, from someone, I didn't have any idea who they were, but they identified themselves. He was the producer for the Oprah Winfrey Show. And they were inviting Jack Spong and Robert Williams to be on the show, and they wanted me to come and speak on the other side. I wasn't really thrilled about going to Chicago, but I did agree to do it, so they said, okay, we'll fly you tomorrow down here to Chicago and then fly you back after the taping of the show. So I went down to Chicago, and there was another segment of the program before we got to our segment. And so I was in the room with Jack Spong. Now, Jack and I had debated each other on television all over the country before. And Jack and I had, even though we were at total opposite ends of the theological spectrum, nonetheless were able to have a personal friendship, at least up until I introduced the resolution to censure him, as it were. And I had a chance to meet Robert Williams, who was a very brash, outspoken young man. And I do remember in the course of when we finally were on the show, and Oprah Winfrey turned to me and she said, well, you're opposed to homosexuals. And I said, no, ma'am. The church does not condemn the orientation of any person. The simple matter is that for us Christians, we are not allowed to engage in sexual relations outside of marriage, whatever the situation. And so that's simply a practice not permitted to us. To which Robert Williams responded, I've been doing it so often that it's not practice anymore. And there was just a notable gasp from the audience. And then he then went on later to make the statement that Mother Teresa would have been better off if she'd been laid. This is the sort of just confrontation of the thing. I mention that because later on, Walter Ryder did ordain Robert to the priesthood, and then there was some action that we took following that. But it was after that other action was taken that I got a letter advising me that Robert Williams was dying of AIDS. And I wrote him. And this was in 1991. And I told him that I had heard that he was terminally ill with AIDS, and that while he and I obviously disagreed on this point, he was a child of Christ, and our Lord died on the cross for him, and what could I do to minister to him? And over the course of the next 6 months, I was able, long distance, to enter into a pastoral relationship with Robert that lasted until he did die. And he was most appreciative of that. He did tell me one thing, and it was a little disturbing. He said, you know, you and I are on the opposite sides of this issue. And he said, you think that my lifestyle is sinful. And he said, but I have to say to you that Jack Spong, who supported me in all this, has never once said one word of concern to me after all of this. And you're the only one who's reached out to me. And I thought, the good Lord will allow us to minister to one another regardless of where we are on things, because the most important thing, and I remember the last thing I said to him was, you know, make your confession, receive God's absolution, and live the last of your life so that you can spend eternity with our Lord. And he wrote back and he says, that's what I've done. But after that revelation from Robert, then Walter Ryder did ordain him to the priesthood. And it was after that that he got crosswise with Jack Spong, and Jack Spong fired him from his job, and they just totally disregarded him. And a number of bishops talked about this, and I was one of them that said, you know, we really need to bring up the point that what Walter Ryder has done is in violation of the clear teaching of the church. It's contrary to the doctrine of the Episcopal Church. And one of the grounds for bringing a bishop to trial is to teach something contrary to the teaching of the church in Title IV, in that list of the offenses for which we can be tried. And it requires a minimum of 10 bishops of jurisdiction to file charges under that wrong teaching, which we did. We prepared a petition on that and filed it with the presiding bishop, and served a copy on Walter Ryder. And a prosecutor was appointed, Hugo Blankenship, whose father had been the Bishop of Cuba years before. Hugo had been on the Board of Trustees for Virginia Seminary and was a very prominent Washington, D.C. lawyer. And the trial was had before a 9-judge court for the trial of a bishop, 9 bishops who had been elected by General Convention, 3 at each convention for term of office, so that there were these 9 bishops. And the trial was had before those 9 bishops. The problem was that 3 of those bishops had themselves ordained knowingly practicing homosexuals. And when we asked them to step down because they were being asked to try something that they themselves had participated in, they refused to recuse themselves to step down. Now, I must say that one of the 9 bishops was the Bishop of Los Angeles, and he had not ordained a practicing homosexual, but during the course of the trial presided over a service at which his suffragan did ordain a practicing homosexual. And at that point, he recused himself. He said, you know, I haven't actually done it, but I've supported it, therefore it wouldn't be proper for me to try this case. So he did, and I do give Fred Borsch credit for that as soon as he took that action, he recused himself, leaving 8 judges, 3 of whom had ordained practicing homosexuals knowingly. So we were going into a situation where almost half of the judges were, quote, guilty of the same thing that Walter Ryder was being accused of. The result of that trial, there were 3 decisions rendered. The first was 4 of the judges held that the church has no core doctrine about the whole question of human sexual conduct, and that therefore Walter Ryder had violated nothing, that there was no core doctrine. And it's interesting, this idea of core doctrine, because there's nothing in the canons that talk about core doctrine. It just says any teaching contrary to the teaching of the church. Then there was a concurring opinion by 3 of the judges saying the church did have a teaching, and the teaching was that it was inappropriate to engage in sexual relations outside of marriage, but that wasn't a core doctrine. That is, it wasn't in the canons. And therefore, though what Walter Ryder did was wrong, you couldn't punish him for it. So they concurred with the 4 judges that had found that there just simply wasn't any law against it. And the 8th judge held that there was clear teaching, that clear teaching was violated, and he should have been found guilty. And that was the decision. There was no way we could take an appeal from that, because what can you appeal? The finding that he was not guilty, in essence, of violating the core doctrine by a 7-1 vote, 4 and then the 3 concurring votes, you cannot appeal a not guilty verdict. You can only appeal a guilty verdict, or you can appeal some part of it that can be reached. And there wasn't anything. We discussed this and came to the conclusion there wasn't anything we could do. That was, in a sense, the beginning of the end in many respects, because the Episcopal Church had, in that period from 1979 to 1991, gone from a clear, very large majority statement that it's not appropriate to engage in sexual relations outside of marriage, to saying the church has no core doctrine that would prohibit this kind of activity. One other thing happened at the same time in 1991, and that is at General Convention in Phoenix in 1991, Bill Fry had been Bishop of Colorado and then resigned from that position to become the Dean of Trinity Episcopal School for Theology. But while he was Bishop of Colorado, there had been a lawsuit filed against a priest for sexual misconduct by the woman claiming to have been the victim of this sexual misconduct, and joining the Diocese of Colorado as a defendant. Now, this is a little complicated, but it needs to be understood. at the trial, the priest was found guilty and a judgment rendered in a rather large sum of money. But the judgment was also rendered against the Diocese of Colorado. And when the case went up to the Colorado Supreme Court on appeal, it was argued by the Diocese of Colorado that they did not condone the activity of this priest, and what he did was contrary to the teaching of the church. And they referred to a similar case involving one of the Roman Catholic dioceses in Colorado. The Supreme Court of Colorado held that in the Roman Catholic case, there is a provision in the Roman Catholic canon law that the priest must be celibate. Therefore, if he engages in sexual relations, he's violating the canon of the church. But they said there is no such canon in the Episcopal Church. There's nothing that says in the canon law of the Episcopal Church that priest is not supposed to engage in sexual relations. And a mere resolution is not canon law. So Bill Fry proposed a canon at the 1991 General Convention that would prohibit members of the clergy from engaging in sexual relations outside of marriage. As he pointed out, had we had such a canon, we wouldn't have got a judgment for over $1 million against the Diocese of Colorado. And all the rest of you are sitting there with, unless you've got a diocesan canon that prohibits sexual relations outside of marriage, you can be sued like we were, and you could subject your diocese to hundreds of thousands of dollars in judgments. So this was proposed partly because that's the teaching of the church, and it goes back to the resolutions of 1977 and 79, and partly because of the result of this Colorado decision. The interesting thing was that the House of Bishops turned the canon down. Now, as a result of that, I went back to my own diocese, and we did a survey of the diocese, and we sent out a survey to every adult member of the diocese. And we got back a very big response. About 10% of the entire adult communicants of the diocese responded. And we had asked 4 questions, and one was, do you think it is inappropriate for a member of the clergy to engage in sexual relations outside of marriage? Do you think the diocese ought to make it clear that this is not something that we should permit? And a similar thing in regard to homosexual relations and so forth. The interesting thing was the response we got back from the Diocese of Eau Claire was over 96%. Well, it varied somewhat on these 4 questions, but somewhere from 94.5% to 96.5% said this is not appropriate for Christian ministers. And we then did adopt a diocesan canon that simply was basically what Bill Fry had proposed to General Convention. Then, as we moved along in 1994 at General Convention in Indianapolis, there was an attempt made to make the ordination of women mandatory. That would have gone after those dioceses that still did not accept the ordination of women to the priesthood or the episcopate. And there was a long debate on that, and we did fight it, and we did finally come up with an understanding, a statement from General Convention, that the ordination of women, that was something that was permitted for Anglicans, but that one was not disloyal if he opposed it, and one was not disloyal if he supported it. And that we needed to take a look on how the church could live together with both sides. And a committee was appointed at that time, made up of individuals representing both viewpoints. And I was on the committee representing those who opposed the ordination of women. And I made the comment at the time, the Episcopal Church has given us 3 years to find a way to live together, because within 3 years this is going to be made mandatory, and it's going to be a problem for those of us who do not support it. And as I had thought, so it came. The committee ended up rejecting every possible compromise way to live together, and ultimately coming out with a proposal that would make the ordination of women mandatory in the Episcopal Church. We're also dealing, as I said, with the human sexuality thing, and also with the whole situation of Jack Spong's teachings about rejecting the creeds, rejecting the authority of Scripture, and all of this. And as a result of that, we were trying to find some way of bringing together the people in the church who wanted to stand for the faith and stay within the Episcopal Church. There was already that centrifugal force causing some people to leave, and we already had the continuing churches that had grown out of the 76th General Convention, and some that had left after that. And one of the things that we were looking at was to try to find a way to hold people together, and that's when, in a conversation that I had with some other church leaders and lawyers, say, the Episcopal Church is not incorporated. So let's incorporate the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. And with that as a corporate structure, use that as a basis to bring together those people who want to uphold the traditional faith of the church. And this is a way that will hold them in the name that was the original name of the church and was no longer being used. The church was calling itself simply the Episcopal Church. And we did that. And we set up that corporation, and that was done early in 1997. And we said that is a vehicle that we can use as we were going into the Philadelphia Convention in 1997. And if the situation reaches the point that we do not see a way of staying in the church, this is a vehicle by which we can hold together. As it happened, there were several areas that we saw as essential to the unity of the church, and if the church took at least 3 actions against the faith of the church, then that would be a trigger for us to take some action on our own. Fortunately, at the moment, that didn't happen. One of the 3 actions was making the ordination of women mandatory, which did happen. But the church did not, at that point, canonically buy into the pansexual. And I say pansexual because there were those advocating the blessing of same-sex unions, but also advocating the blessing of sexual relations outside of marriage that would be what at law we call a meretricious relationship. That didn't quite happen, but one of the things as a result of what came out of that 1997 General Convention was a call by what was then the Episcopal Synod of America for the establishment of an Orthodox province in America. And that is an Orthodox Anglican province that would not be culpable for the corruption of the Christian faith. And then looking towards the Lambeth Conference of 1998 as a way of addressing this whole problem. Now, the Pecusa Inc. Corporation was then used by us sort of as a tool to lead into something that was growing out of First Promise. And Chuck Murphy, who was the leader of First Promise, was also on the board of directors, or board of trustees for Pecusa Inc. And we saw this as a possible vehicle to move forward with that. It was then decided not to take that form and to use the structure of the Episcopal Church, but rather that First Promise movement went in a different direction, and that grew out of our trip to Singapore in the early part of 1998 when Bishop Fitz Alison and Bishop Dickson and myself and John Schuler went to meet with Moses Tay in Singapore, and then out of that some things happened and moved, and after the 1998 Lambeth Conference, further things, and though I was not a part to what happened in 2000, because by then I had retired and was doing some other things. Out of that came what became known as the Anglican Mission in America, and the ordination of Chuck Murphy and John Rogers as the first two bishops, which was sort of a move along the lines of all that we'd been doing with Pecusa Inc. and also with the Episcopal Synod of America, looking towards an Orthodox province. We went to the 2000 General Convention, which was in Denver, and at that convention, the General Convention adopted a resolution in regard to human sexuality, which came within a hair of totally approving the homosexual agenda. It stopped just short of it, and there was the feeling from some people that maybe this was a way we could have dialogue and not commit ourselves to what would happen. However, that resolution, which was interpreted widely differently by the two different sides, simply paved the way for what happened in 2003 when Vicki Jean Robinson was elected Bishop of New Hampshire, living in a committed homosexual relationship. And as I have already mentioned before, that this led, when his election was confirmed, to a number of us appealing on the floor of the House of Bishops to the Archbishop of Canterbury for action and calling for the primates to be convened to deal with this. And then adding to that the action of the House of Bishops in 2003 to refuse to approve the Lambeth Quadrilateral Articles of Religion, in effect to reject the basis of the Christian faith. And for most of us, that made it very clear that something had to be done. And efforts were being made through what was called the Anglican Communion Network to tie together dioceses that would work together to try to save the Episcopal Church from within. By 2006, at the General Convention, it became obvious that this simply wasn't going to happen. And by that time, the primates of the Anglican Communion had called for a report, the so-called Windsor Report, which called for several things: the end of crossing diocesan boundaries on the part of the Orthodox, but a moratorium on the ordination of practicing homosexuals or the blessing of same-sex unions. And the Episcopal Church was faced with having to respond to the Archbishop of Canterbury and the primates and the Windsor Report. And so the response was a resolution that would have called for a moratorium. And that resolution was defeated in the House of Deputies at General Convention in 2006. And then in the House of Deputies, after the defeat, there was a motion to reconsider. And the motion to reconsider failed. Under the rules of the House of Deputies, once the House of Deputies votes a certain way on a piece of legislation and refuses to reconsider, the issue cannot be brought up again in the House of Deputies at that convention. Nonetheless, the House of Bishops was presented with a new resolution on the same subject, that is, agreeing to support the Windsor Report and calling for a moratorium on the ordination of practicing homosexuals and the blessing of same-sex unions. And the House of Bishops passed it. There were a number of speeches in the House of Bishops. That was the last speech I ever made in the House of Bishops, was at that debate. And the interesting thing is there were two of us who stood up and opposed this resolution. And one of them was myself, and the other was Vicki Jean Robinson, for diametrically opposed reasons. But we both opposed the resolution. It passed anyway, by a very narrow margin. And then it went to the House of Deputies the next day, which was the last day of convention. Under the rules, the House of Deputies couldn't consider it because they'd already considered the matter, voted it down, and refused to reconsider. So under their rules, it couldn't happen. And then we had the beginning of this whole wonderful way of disregarding the canons. I mean, it had been going on in the church somewhat, but they took the position in the House of Deputies, and a joint meeting of the bishops and deputies was called to deal with this. And the presiding bishop, Frank Griswold, said, what we'll do is we'll suspend the rules. And by vote of suspending the rules, the House of Deputies can then reconsider the same matter. You can't suspend the rules to avoid enforcing the rules on a matter already dealt with. But that's what they did. So the House of Deputies then did vote by a very narrow margin to approve this. And the American Church then said, well, we're in compliance. We're not breaking the rules. At that point, it became obvious that the Episcopal Church had lost all sense of honor and decency, because what had been done by General Convention was a smokescreen. They had no intention of doing it, and it's very clear that from the close of convention in 2006, we continued to have the blessing of same-sex unions, and dioceses supporting the blessing of same-sex unions, and bishops providing liturgical forms for the blessing of same-sex unions. And we had practicing homosexuals being ordained or being nominated for bishop in other dioceses, in the Diocese of Minnesota and the Diocese of Chicago and so forth. And finally, in 2009, you have General Convention saying, in effect, we will ordain practicing homosexuals to the episcopate if they're elected. And we will allow dioceses to respond pastorally to the needs of blessing same-sex unions, especially in those states where such marriages are now permitted by law. And as a result, the Diocese of Los Angeles this year elected, and the Episcopal Church confirmed the election of a partnered lesbian as suffragan of that diocese. And we have dioceses such as Washington, D.C., now embracing the blessing of same-sex unions. So the Episcopal Church at this point is in total non-compliance with the Windsor Report. And at this point, I think even the most sanguine Orthodox Christian would say it is totally impossible to save the Episcopal Church at this point from having embraced what is clearly contrary to the Christian religion.